Hey everyone, we're back with part 2. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, don't forget to stop right now, watch part 1, and then come back here afterward so you can be well informed of everything that went down in this very mysterious case.
While authorities continued their investigation, friends, family members, and even independent journalists started looking into the case themselves, determined to uncover the truth behind the Jamisons' mysterious disappearance. The family was really upset when the police started suggesting that maybe Bobby and Sherilyn had hurt each other. They pushed back hard on that idea, saying that even though things hadn't been perfect, Sherilyn was genuinely trying to make things better with Bobby, when they really believed that this whole family just needed a fresh start, especially after everything that they'd been through.
Interestingly, a Panola Mountain resident, not Dylan, this was another local, told an investigative journalist, because now it's almost like podcasters and whatnot, like these independent people are like, I'm going to solve the case. But this person had said they saw a white truck before it was officially reported as abandoned. And at the time, they assumed it was a maintenance worker. So this witness also noted that before the heavy rains came, they spotted tire tracks indicating another vehicle had left the scene. And to them, it appeared that the family might have willingly or unwillingly left their truck and gotten into another vehicle. And remember I said, when a dog loses a scent, it's usually because someone has been picked up from that location. But still, investigators wondered why anyone would take this family somewhere else, because this location they were already in was isolated. Meaning, if someone was going to hurt them, why not do it right there? No one would have seen anything.
Around Eufaula, the local gossip started taking a different turn. People began speculating that maybe Sherilyn and Bobby were involved with drugs, but friends and family shut that down real fast. Sherilyn's mom, Connie, even pointed out that she lived with them just a few months earlier and everything seemed totally normal. And backing that up, deputies didn't find any drugs or anything illegal in their home when they searched it. And during that 2-week stretch of investigation, they decided to check out Bobby and Sherilyn's church, especially since multiple people had mentioned how spiritual they were, and that Bobby had been even asking for advice about their house being haunted, and the other strange stuff. Bobby's phone records actually showed that he called someone from the church on October 7th. They were members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Muskogee. So investigators went there hoping that someone might know who the family had been talking to in those final days. At first, detectives thought about talking to the preacher, Geraldo Alonso, but they ended up deciding not to. He really didn't know the Jamisons that well. Instead, they spoke with Gary Brandon, a church elder who had actually attended prayer meetings with Sherilyn pretty regularly. Bobby wasn't super religious himself, but Sherilyn had a really strong spiritual side like we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and her husband is going to support what she does.
Right.
And I think her beliefs kind of rubbed off on him over time because he was consulting. And Gary told the investigators that Sherilyn and Bobby had become convinced over the past several months that their home was indeed haunted. She reportedly spoke of seeing spirits, including angels, and we told you the ghost of her sister. He's relaying this to investigators because, we already told you, but he's telling them for the first time. Sherilyn believed that their daughter Madison also saw these spirits, and Bobby even considered performing that exorcism. So that's what he was doing. He was trying to get all the information about how he could do this himself, because there are no experts in the spiritual side of things like that.
Detectives weren't entirely convinced by Gary's account, though. Given his affiliation with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, authorities wondered if Gary's perspective might have influenced his recollection. They also considered whether the Jamisons might have shared similar apocalyptic beliefs, raising further concerns about the family's mental state. However, Bobby's mother, Starlet, strongly doubted this narrative. She insisted that her son wasn't the type to genuinely believe in ghosts or spirits. To her, the entire scenario felt exaggerated and far-fetched. Like Kimber said, it might have been to appease his wife, not because he actually believed it.
Yeah, that's what his mother said. He was just trying to appease Sherilyn. But still, Nikki and Starlet both confirmed that the Jamisons' lakefront home had always felt strange, possibly even haunted. Nikki, along with Starlet and Nikki's husband, who himself was an atheist, so wasn't into anything spiritual, they were all convinced that there were supernatural things going on there. They all described witnessing a strange gray mist that was slowly drifting down the stairs into the living room. And that is weird, I have to say. Even the atheist is saying, this is strange. Like,
Yeah.
I'm seeing this thing coming down. Nikki also described experiencing an intense wave of sadness or depression whenever she entered the family's house. And then she said she would have unexplained nausea and stomach aches. She recounted a particularly disturbing incident that Sherilyn had recently shared, where Bobby had lunged at her in a really aggressive manner as if he was temporarily possessed.
Or maybe he was just angry.
Yeah, but it sounds concerning either way.
Driven by curiosity and concern, Sherilyn had conducted her own research on the property. She believed the land might have been sacred or possibly built over an old cemetery. In fact, their home stood near Eufaula Lake, which had submerged an entire ghost town.
Wow, that's interesting.
The area was originally home to the Creek people. They used it for major intertribal gatherings long before settlers ever showed up. But then again, as some people pointed out, a lot of places in the country are built on land with heavy, complicated histories. So maybe those ghost stories weren't all that far out of the ordinary after all.
But then there was also the witch stuff. And what I mean by that was that Nikki openly explained to investigators that Sherilyn never hid the fact that she practiced Wicca, sometimes even describing herself as a witch. We know she wrote that on the container. And the two friends had even practiced seances together. And at one point, they exchanged witches' Bibles. But she said that it was just a funny gift between them. Even though it was kind of a bold move given the conservative nature of their small Oklahoma town, but Sherilyn joked openly with neighbors, inviting them over for witch's brew. She was just playfully referring to like beer as like, would you like to have like witch's brew tonight?
Sure.
And Nikki admitted that Sherilyn had always been more deeply into Wicca than she was, and she had a vibrant personality and sometimes enjoyed exaggerating her spiritual beliefs, kind of like we said, to keep people at a distance. That Sherilyn was naturally introverted and didn't like people bothering her. Knowing that the local community tended to be wary of these unconventional beliefs, especially in this rural place, Sherilyn would deliberately kind of lean into it. And I think that that's, I want to say normal. It's like she has this eccentric personality, so she's not going to let people change her.
Right.
And it was suspicious that her cats began to mysteriously pass away. She and Colton discovered one of the cats lifeless on their back porch, and another was hidden beneath an armchair. So Sherilyn was convinced that someone had poisoned them. And although the family couldn't afford the expensive toxicology test to prove it, Sherilyn already had strong suspicions about a specific neighbor of theirs. This neighbor had previously complained about Sherilyn's cats climbing onto his boat. So that gave her a reason to suspect that maybe he wanted to get rid of them. And she didn't go to the cops because she didn't want to draw more attention to themselves and the entire situation to make it worse.
Meanwhile, Nikki had created the Facebook group called Find the Jamesons and Jameson Warriors, pulling together psychics, independent investigators, and concerned citizens who were determined to help solve the case. Through this group, she began receiving dozens of direct messages, some offering support, others tips, and still others claiming insider knowledge. And one day, Nikki got a message from a woman named Beverly, who said she lived near Panola Mountain and wanted to help. Beverly seemed really kind and trustworthy, so Nikki gave her access to the Google map that she had made. It had all the important coordinates marked, where the Jameson truck was found, spots Sheriff Beaucamp had searched, and other key areas. Nikki even gave Beverly the passwords to her Google account. And looking back, she realized that was definitely a mistake. Not long after that, Beverly asked Nikki to meet her at a cabin on Panola Mountain. Nikki said she'd think about it, but didn't agree right away. And then the very next day, something really disturbing happened. Nikki discovered that a bunch of emails and key documents tied to the Jameson case had suddenly vanished from her account. They weren't in the trash folder, and even worse, she found herself completely locked out of her own email. It turns out Beverly, or whoever was behind that name, had purposely deleted all that critical info. When Nikki dug deeper, she realized that Beverly was connected to several burner accounts, and it was obvious now that someone was intentionally trying to mess with the investigation.
Yeah, that would be really weird. I mean, why would she want to erase maps and take away critical information? It was just odd.
Yeah.
It was like somebody was trying to hide something. But despite this unsettling incident, Nikki didn't back down. As Sheriff Beaucamp continued systematic grid searches across the mountain, Nikki was conducting her own independent investigation. She was personally talking to people living in that area. And during one of these trips, she encountered Dylan and struck up a conversation. Nikki asked him what he did for a living, and he told her that he sold bath products. And she was curious. She said, "Oh, can I buy some?" And that's when Dylan hesitated. And then he admitted, well, he didn't have any social media presence or an online website. And she found that to be really strange. How are you going to sell something all the way up there in basically the middle of nowhere without having a business online?
Yeah.
So this only added to her suspicion because she already knew from investigators that he was building that cabin and pouring cement. So in her mind, she considered Dylan somebody that the investigators should take another look at. Nikki's theory was straightforward, but really scary. She believed that Dylan might have blocked in the Jamisons' vehicle, or at the very least, he might know who did. And maybe because he's trying to be helpful, he really knew something. In her perspective, the family had either been specifically targeted or tragically just ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. But in either scenario, Nikki was convinced they had been kidnapped. And I don't blame her best friend for doing all this. I think we all need a friend like Nikki who just will not give up.
Nikki continued exploring her theory by carefully examining the area near the Jamisons' truck. Nearby, she discovered a battered blue truck covered in graffiti and riddled with bullet holes. Locals apparently used it frequently for target practice, and it was marked all over with disturbing satanic-themed messages. But as Nikki studied it closely, she noticed something that immediately caught her attention. Scrawled over the dark graffiti were softer messages in familiar handwriting. Phrases like "peace" and "God loves you." She quickly recognized the handwriting, and it belonged to Sherilyn. Nikki wondered if perhaps Sherilyn's attempt to cover or challenge these disturbing messages had provoked someone's anger. Maybe someone saw her writing over their stuff and became furious. That's what Nikki speculated. And Nikki continued, "Honestly, it wouldn't surprise me up there if that set someone off enough to kidnap her and her family." Realizing that this wasn't a detail that investigators had noticed, Nikki immediately shared it in her Find the Jamisons Facebook group, hoping to generate new leads. And soon after, she began receiving messages with tips, some more credible than others. One person claimed that the Jamisons had been killed and buried beneath Marble City Bridge about an hour away from Eufaula.
This is all really scary. I mean, you're
Yeah.
like doing your own investigation. She's risking talking to sketchy people. She's putting together clues that the investigators didn't even find. I mean, she was the one that recognized her own best friend's, handwriting, so to speak. It was in spray paint. But on this, we're going to show this, on this abandoned truck that was out there that was used for target practice. People would shoot it. So you're thinking, could my friend be caught in the crossfire? But another tip was really chilling. Someone suggested looking into this guy named Kevin Sweat. He was a notorious local criminal and murderer. The tipster mentioned that Kevin had named his cat Stormy, which was also Madison Jamison's middle name, and often went target shooting at Marble City Quarry. So Kevin had reportedly viewed the graffiti-covered blue truck on Panola Mountains as his personal property, and he regularly shot at it. So this theory was pretty disturbing. Maybe Kevin caught Sherilyn spray painting these positive messages over what he considered his truck. He got enraged and he attacked the family. Nikki followed up on this lead, and though Kevin Sweat's face seemed vaguely familiar, she couldn't find solid proof connecting him directly to the Jamison family. And by this time, Kevin had already been arrested and jailed for murdering 2 women and was later sentenced to 3 life sentences after a brutal attack on his own lawyer using a razor blade. So this man was very dangerous. And although this was compelling, this tip ultimately remained unconfirmed. But it was just another question. Nikki was even more concerned for her friend's life at this point.
And then there was the family angle. Like we mentioned earlier, Bobby and his dad didn't always get along, but years before all of this, Bobby had actually worked really closely with him. He believed he co-signed a loan with his dad back in the 80s, thinking that one day the real estate property they were fixing up would eventually be his. Back in 2008, when Bob Sr. filed for divorce from Bobby's mom, Starlet, everything came crashing down. Bobby found out the property was actually only in his parents' names. He was heartbroken. All of his life, he thought he'd have a share, but it turned out he wasn't entitled to anything. He felt totally betrayed and crushed, like his future had been ripped away, and he started stressing hard about how he was going to take care of his daughter. Despite all this conflict, Bob had always made sure Bobby had work. Even after selling the gas station they used to run together, he still was open to giving Bobby other properties. But honestly, things between them were starting to get really tense at that point. On May 11th of 2009, just 5 months before the family disappeared, Bobby had actually filed a lawsuit against both of his parents in Oklahoma County. He claimed he suffered mental anguish and lost out on over $10,000 in revenue, saying that he was never fairly paid for all the work he did in the family business growing up. Starlet told investigators later that she had no idea there was even a financial issue, and said that she would have been totally happy giving Bobby her share if she had known.
And that's really interesting because these family feuds, they have led to things happening. And around the same time, tensions escalated even further. Bobby filed a restraining order against his own father, alleging serious threats. And in these court filings, Bobby claimed that his father had threatened to kill him and his family on at least 2 different occasions.
Wow.
He detailed one frightening incident on November 1st of 2008 when he and his father got into a heated argument. Bobby alleged that as his father tried to leave a parking lot, he'd attempted to stop his vehicle only to be intentionally struck by his father's car. Another threat allegedly occurred in April of 2009. And in his statement, Bobby described his father as a very dangerous man who thinks he's above the law, further alleging that Bob Sr., who was 67 at the time, was involved in criminal activities, including dealing with sex workers, gang affiliations, and methamphetamines. And Bobby also accused his father of verbally promising 2 vehicles to his granddaughter, Madison, promises that he later refused to honor by legally transferring the car titles. So Bobby stated he was living in ongoing fear due to his father's threats against him, his family, and even his mom, Starlet.
But Bob Sr. had faced significant personal struggles throughout his life, dealing with financial debt, mental health challenges, and serious substance-related issues involving both drugs and alcohol. Starlet openly acknowledged that while her ex-husband wasn't necessarily a monster, he certainly had a fierce temper. She also heard unsettling rumors linking him to dangerous groups like the Mexican Mafia. Connection she believed once led to one of Bob's businesses mysteriously burning down in Oklahoma City. Their divorce in 2008 made tensions even worse. Bob became increasingly angry, prompting Starlet to temporarily move in with Sherilyn and Bobby to escape the conflict. Despite these claims, Bob adamantly denied everything and flatly refused to relinquish any properties or possessions. When Bob got called to court over Bobby's accusations, he flat out denied everything. Then on May 1st, 2009, after hearing testimony from Bob's brother Jack, who is also Bobby's uncle, a judge dismissed the protective order Bobby had filed, saying Bob wasn't an immediate threat. The fraud stuff didn't get resolved right away, but in the end, it all got dropped because the whole family went missing. So of course, investigators started wondering, could that have been a motive?
Yeah, like I said, the family feuds, they have led to murder before, even in a few cases that we have done, sadly. And Bob's brother, Jack Jameson, was the one who broke the news to Bob that his son Bobby was missing. And Bob immediately realized authorities would probably consider him a potential suspect. So right away, he's like,
Probably me.
Yep, they're going to look at me. He quickly provided an alibi. He explained that he had been moving between different medical and care facilities at the time that they had vanished. And at this point, Bob was actually seriously ill. He was dealing with diabetes, kidney failure, and early onset dementia. He had been in and out of psychiatric hospitals and hospice care, making it very unlikely, at least physically, that he could have been directly involved in a crime if a crime was committed. I mean, the FBI was leaning towards a theory that this family had gotten lost in the woods and succumbed to exposure, just the elements, hunger, and things like that. But they still needed to rule out family members as potential suspects just in case. So the investigators decided to question Bobby's uncle, Jack Jameson, about his brother Bob's capabilities, his mental state, and Jack described his brother as disturbed, but strongly believed Bob wasn't physically or mentally capable of carrying out a crime.
However, Jack didn't hold back about his personal feelings towards his nephew Bobby. He bluntly told police that he didn't care for Bobby, calling him spoiled and a mooch, adding that Bobby had a habit of exaggerating situations. Given Jack's openly negative feelings, investigators weren't sure if he could possibly have a motive to harm the family, and still, Jack's clear animosity toward Bobby made him a potential suspect. So in order to be thorough, authorities took a DNA sample from him as part of the investigation.
But then there was finally a real lead in this case.
Here we go.
On October 23rd of 2009, the investigators discovered that the Jameson home was equipped with surveillance cameras. These had been installed earlier by Starlet due to her being scared of the threats from Bob Sr. In fact, Starlet herself had them installed, and even at her own residence, because she was concerned about Bob's behavior, so she wanted to catch something on camera.
This discovery felt significant. It gave authorities a real chance to see who was coming and going from the Jamesons' home and possibly find out whether these supposed spirits that the family had reported might actually be visitors or intruders. But unfortunately, the cameras were pointed toward the driveway, not at the roof or the doors or other key parts of the property.
Yeah. And what they were thinking is like, maybe they weren't spirits you saw, but people robbing them instead.
Right. When the investigators looked at the footage from October 7th and 8th, right before the family vanished, they saw the Jamesons packing up their white GMC truck. On the 8th, around 2:15 p.m., the video caught them making the final moves to leave. It was very windy, leaves were swirling all around the driveway, and we're going to show you a short clip. Sherilyn was wearing a yellow shirt and blue jeans, and Madison had on a white shirt with dark pants. Bobby was in a white shirt too, but here's the weird part. He kept changing clothing throughout the video. He actually started in a darker shirt, maybe gray, and then switched to the white one, so it's kind of strange.
And what was also kind of strange was that all the truck doors were open as this family continuously walked back and forth between the house and the vehicle about 20 times each. So 40 trips minimum of Sherilyn going back and forth and her husband going back and forth. Bobby and Sherilyn back and forth and back and forth. But here's the thing. They did not have anything in their hands. Like no luggage, no equipment. So why were they continuously going back and forth? It was very weird. And they had like very robotic kind of movements. I mean, granted, I was watching this video and we only have a clip of it. It doesn't record thoroughly, you know what I mean? It's like it kind of stops like
that.
Right,
it skips frames, yeah.
It's like all these little frames. So of course your movements are kind of going to look weird. But just the fact that they kept going back and forth and they would kind of, you know, as people say, like two ships passing in the night. It was kind of like that. It was kind of like husband and wife were in their own world.
Mm-hmm.
Strange. We're going to be showing you this. But their demeanor was strange. It was like they were disconnected, not even making eye contact with one another or interacting as a family. You know, like the little girl wasn't being picked up and she wasn't playing with a toy and the mom wasn't like kneeling down and interacting with her and she wasn't like patting her husband on the shoulder. Strange. It was strange to me. When I was watching this, I was like, it doesn't look normal. And investigators described the scene as disturbingly robotic, almost trance-like, as if the family were characters in a video game going through scripted motions without any visible emotions or interaction. And this left investigators even more confused and concerned. Like I said, we only have a few seconds of this video, but it does seem odd. They really aren't moving anything. They're just walking back and forth so many times. Nikki and Starlet also reviewed what was a 2-minute segment of footage that we don't have the whole thing, and they immediately sensed that something was wrong. They believed that Bobby and Sherilyn appeared to be under pressure, possibly being forced into putting things into their truck by someone else. They pointed out a figure in a brown or gray shirt, and we mentioned this. I'm going to screenshot this right here and show it to you. They said that this was someone else, not Bobby. However, since people moved in and out of frame frequently, it remained unclear if it was actually another person or Bobby himself, and the investigators ruled that this was Bobby, that he had merely changed into another shirt.
To better understand this strange footage, Sheriff Beaucamp even brought in an expert psychologist to examine the full 30 minutes of footage captured by multiple cameras.
Right. The 2 minutes was just like that one portion that was released to the family, but then there were a lot more.
The psychologist offered a different interpretation. To her, the behavior clearly suggested drug use, specifically methamphetamine. She explained to investigators that individuals on meth often compulsively change clothes or repeatedly start or abandon activities. This, she said, could explain why Bobby changed his clothes and why the family repeatedly moved back and forth to their vehicle, appearing disconnected and unfocused. She even noted that young Madison mirrored her parents' odd movements, suggesting she could have been either imitating their behavior or, more disturbingly, possibly exposed to the drugs herself.
But this suggestion that the Jamesons were involved with drugs had unintended consequences. It intensified harmful speculation, as you can imagine. There were rumors going all around with these theories, and now people were blaming them for their own disappearance. Friends and family rejected these allegations, insisting that the Jamesons had faced struggles, but they were genuinely loving and caring people, and they were not drug users. They maintained that Sherilyn and Bobby were clean and had not been using drugs in the months leading up to their disappearance. In fact, we already told you, the FBI came in, thoroughly searched both the Jameson home and their truck, and there were no signs of drugs or amphetamines or any paraphernalia at all. So there was nothing to support these allegations. So I saw so many people on Reddit, and this was mean, and I'm just bringing it up because these are things that people think of. They were like, they look like crackheads, they're skinny, it looks like they're on meth, there's all these different signs. But then there were other people that said no, because if you were readily using, there would be evidence around your house.
Yeah, for sure.
Remember when I told you that Sherilyn's mom started to quickly clean the house? Well, there were theories on Reddit that she did that because she didn't want the stigma that this family was using. All of those things could be true, right? But they would have had to throw away everything before they left that day, or it had to be cleaned up.
Right. Still, the suggestion of drugs opened up a troubling new angle to the investigation. Latimer County had long struggled with a serious methamphetamine problem. Both crystal and powder were widely available throughout Oklahoma, particularly in the early 2000s, and local law enforcement knew all too well how pervasive it was. Deputy Woodruff noted that the number of people who disappeared in Latimer County every year was outrageous and amazing. So high, in fact, that many locals quietly suspected a serial killer or perhaps multiple serial killers might be operating in the area.
That's crazy. I mean, there were so many people. I didn't look into that theory as much as I looked into other ones.
And that one guy went to jail.
I know, and he was murdering people. Now, Chrissy, a close friend of the Jamesons, echoed the sentiment, describing Panola Mountain as an area with a deeply disturbing reputation. She stated that if someone offered her $1 million to purchase land near Panola Mountain, she wouldn't even consider it. And just 6 months before the Jamesons disappeared in the spring of 2008, federal agents had carried out a major drug bust in Eufaula, arresting 14 individuals that were involved in these rings with all kinds of substances that we can't mention here. But this operation was extensive. It involved coordinated efforts by local, state, and federal authorities, and it exposed how deeply this problem really was. What he's trying to say, remember this. So given this backdrop, some people began speculating that Bobby and Sherilyn might not be doing anything, but maybe they were selling these substances. And maybe that's why they had so much cash, because they were getting money from people. But that had already been ruled out because we know where the cash came from.
Investigators quickly questioned the logic of that theory. If the disappearance had resulted from a drug deal gone wrong, wouldn't the money have been taken from the vehicle? Bobby and Sherilyn had clearly told friends and family that their purpose on Panola Mountain was to purchase land and pursue an off-grid lifestyle. Naturally, they need cash to buy property, and the presence of the money alone wasn't necessarily evidence of illicit activity. Others speculated that Bobby and Sherilyn might have staged their own disappearance, perhaps to escape trouble connected to drug dealing.
Oh, this was like a Sherry Papini, and she's got a new documentary out. I would love to dive into that case just for fun. She seems very unhinged. But would this couple purposely stage a disappearance, but then not take any of their things? But I guess that would make it more believable. But their dog? I don't know.
Not the dog. Given the couple owned several timeshare properties and had expressed fear regarding Bobby's father, Bob Sr., some theorized that they fled to Mexico to start over. In fact, one neighbor even claimed to have personally seen the Jamesons in Mexico, stating that they were definitely alive and simply hiding out. Another theory shared by an investigator suggested that the Jamesons had used their Cancun timeshare as a base for illicit activity to bring in back to the United States. This theory also provided an answer about why Sherilyn might have suddenly dyed Madison's hair blonde.
I didn't understand that. They were saying that they were trying to hide her identity.
Right, but why wouldn't they change their own identity, just the girl?
No. And I mean, I already said this, but she's a hairstylist.
Right.
It's harmless. I mean, I understand that some parents would think, oh, that's kind of drastic. Would I bleach my daughter's hair? I don't know. I put highlights in Shiloh's hair when she was like 8. They just wondered if this was an attempt to disguise the family somehow. And they also thought she pulled Madison out of school because they were preparing to escape and they were already in danger. But of course, like many of the other theories, there were flaws. If they truly planned to flee the country, why leave behind the dog, the money? It didn't make sense. And you may be sick of the substance-related angle. I understand that, but there's more. Sherilyn's mom, Connie, told investigators something alarming. She said, I can tell you, Bobby had recently gone to the police to report someone in the area for running a meth lab. Obviously, that person would be very upset, she said.
Some people think that the lab might have been connected to Bobby's dad, Bob Sr., and maybe even tied to a bigger operation. If that's true, it could explain why Bob Sr. was supposedly so angry with Bobby. There were even 2 inmates who claimed that after this big narcotics bust in Eufaula in 2008, Bobby had snitched on them to the cops. But why would Bobby risk something like that? Maybe he was just desperate for money, but still, doing that could have put him and his whole family in danger.
I mean, I was thinking maybe they were sick of people in that neighborhood, near their dream home, making it a crappy place to live.
Right.
Because I could see why someone would report that activity.
Right.
If you see something like that, you should say something. That's dangerous. Those kind of places blow up randomly. They contaminate water. They can harm people in the neighborhood. So I would expect people to tell on that activity.
Remember, Heather, the private investigator who worked on the case, suspected that Bobby might have been an FBI informant and was possibly targeted due to his connections with the local scene. She believed that Bobby was more likely to be using rather than actively selling.
There were just so many theories, and this informant theory was so popular, the cyber sleuths just got a hold of that. They speculated that the Jamison family might have even been in witness protection. However, Matt Bond, the Latimer County undersheriff, disagreed, stating that he had never heard anything credible about Bobby being an informant, nor did he believe the disappearance resulted from any of these substances or like a deal gone wrong. Another investigator, Brett, offered a different perspective, suggesting that the key to understanding the case was all about examining the Jamisons' finances. He pointed out an inconsistency. Despite both Sherilyn and Bobby being on disability with no steady employment, they were still managing to pay their taxes, buy a brand new truck, maintain several timeshares, and own a boat and a jet ski. Brett theorized that Bobby was possibly interested in buying remote land on the mountain to establish his own operation. You know what I'm talking about? Substances. He argued that converting a shipping container, something Bobby and Sherilyn had openly planned to do, could make sense as a hidden setup for this entire production. And then Brett pointed out a known reality. Owing money to powerful people in the substance trade industry could lead to violence and even death. Sheriff Beaucamp also voiced suspicions about their income, suggesting that they might have been involved in scams, highlighting the $64,000 settlement Bobby received from his 2005 car accident was an example that was a scam, that he purposely went around that curve to get hit because they knew that area really well. It was in front of Sherilyn's work, and she would know that it's a known area where people could accidentally hit someone.
Well, Bobby's cousin Dana expressed skepticism about these theories. She remarked, I don't think Bobby had the fortitude to be a dealer. He would help someone in distress, so I can't see him selling. Maybe they accidentally stumbled upon something they shouldn't have. Bobby was always pretty gullible. It's possible someone lured him up there, end quote. Turning a shipping container into a lab might have made sense given the area, but a lot of people felt like the whole investigation was getting mishandled. There were claims that cops were leaking stuff they shouldn't have and painting the Jamisons as scammers, drug users, and just obsessed with death instead of actually trying to figure out what happened.
There was a lot of victim blaming going on, and it was everywhere. It was online. It was in the investigation. It was almost like I said from the start, they really didn't do their due diligence. They didn't fingerprint. They didn't look for things. And honestly, honestly, I was so done with all these theories, it was kind of getting out of hand when I was reading it. But even with all the theories circulating, some investigators continued leaning towards the possibility of a murder and self-inflicted death at the hands of Sherilyn herself, especially as details emerged about her mental health. This theory was very upsetting, especially to Nikki, who found it frustrating that the investigators seemed eager to label the case as substance-related or a murder, particularly by her friend, Sherilyn, just because she owned a gun. So hoping for some deeper insight, the detectives spoke to Sherilyn's therapist, and they discovered that in the recent years, Sherilyn had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, a condition characterized by significant mood swings, shifting between intense depressive episodes and periods of elevated mood, known as hypomania. She had been prescribed medication to help stabilize her moods, but Sherilyn did not always take it consistently. Like many people who experience relief after starting a medication, Sherilyn would sometimes stop taking her prescriptions once she started to feel better. She would believe that she no longer needed them, but unfortunately, abruptly stopping psychiatric medicine, especially for bipolar, can lead to instability, severe instability.
Sherilyn always had reservations about Western medicine in general. She expressed discomfort with the idea of relying on psychiatric medications long term and wanted to manage her condition naturally whenever possible. Friends understood her hesitation, but acknowledged that managing bipolar disorder typically requires ongoing treatment. Sherilyn's inconsistent use of medication may have contributed to her emotional instability, making investigators even more concerned about her state of mind. This wasn't new for Sherilyn. She had struggled with intense mood swings her whole life, but those very ups and downs were part of what made Sherilyn uniquely herself. She was spontaneous, she was passionate, fully embracing the moment and throwing herself wholeheartedly into new projects, gardening, renovating, decorating, only to lose interest just as quickly. At first, her friend Nikki wondered if Sherilyn might have just had ADHD, but gradually, Sherilyn's behaviors became more extreme, especially when it came to impulsive spending.
Nikki distinctly remembered realizing that Sherilyn was experiencing mania after she rented a building for 6 months, planning to convert it into her own hair salon. And then when Nikki checked in on her just a few weeks later, Sherilyn responded casually as if she'd completely forgotten about the whole project. She was like, "Oh, that? Oh, no, I'm not doing that anymore." So Starlet described her daughter-in-law as two different people. When Sherilyn was consistently taking her meds, she was happy, she was stable and balanced. But off of them, she would swing sharply between deep depression and intense manic episodes. In her manic phase, Sherilyn would become irritable, angry, and sometimes self-destructive.
And honestly, that substance angle wasn't all that far-fetched. It turns out back when Sherilyn was living in Oklahoma City, she really wanted to help friends who were dealing with addiction, but it ended up pulling her into some dark stuff. People from the salon she worked at said that she would let friends who were struggling with substances move in, trying to support them, but it backfired. Sherilyn got caught up in the substances herself, and eventually Bobby did too. Nikki said Sherilyn eventually pulled herself out of the rough patch and got clean. She went into recovery and was doing better, and during that time she was prescribed Xanax for her anxiety, but since Xanax is a depressant and doesn't actually treat depression, it made things more complicated for her mentally. Even her son Colton admitted that she'd been using Xanax and opioids, trying to deal with everything she was feeling, but in all the wrong ways. She even had too much once and had to be rushed to the hospital. It all started spiraling after Bobby's car accident. She began taking his meds, and it only got worse after her sister Marla passed away.
As a way to manage these overwhelming emotions, Sherilyn developed the habit of writing down her thoughts, filling journal after journal from cover to cover with deeply personal and often disturbing entries. Investigators later found these journals, which provided a troubling glimpse into Sherilyn's emotional state. In hindsight, these writings helped explain the harsh and angry letter that Sherilyn had written to Bobby. If she was off her meds and deeply distressed, her frustration and agitation would have easily spilled out onto those pages, probably not even intended to be read by Bobby. He might have never even seen them. It didn't mean that she wasn't capable of harming someone. As a matter of fact, according to accounts shared by neighbors and their families, both Bobby and Sherilyn had a troubled history involving DV incidents. Sherilyn reportedly displayed verbal, emotional, and at times physical aggression towards both Colton and Bobby. Additionally, there were allegations that Bobby had once become physical and pushed Sherilyn down the stairs during an argument. And this is why Colton moved out. He couldn't handle his mother's unpredictable moods. Later, during a custody hearing, Colton shared his concerns, stating sometimes mom is depressed and behaves strangely.
Investigators learned that CPS had visited the Jamisons' home multiple times after reports surfaced alleging substance use and unhealthy environment for Madison. However, despite these visits, CPS never found conditions severe enough to remove Madison from the home. Authorities also recognized that grief, especially over losing a loved one, can manifest in intense physical pain. Additionally, withdrawal from opioids and certain psychiatric conditions can lead to hallucinations, further complicating Sherilyn's mental health struggles.
Everything we just told you is not uncommon for people. They're struggling with really intense things that are happening, accidents, physical things, mental things, emotional things. And so you can see how this could all come together. And as we explained earlier, the financial pressures increased significantly after Colton moved out, as the family was no longer receiving child support payments from his father. Coupled with Sherilyn's episodes of manic spending, this made keeping up with the bills increasingly difficult. Investigators considered the possibility that the family might have become desperate enough financially to explore riskier ways of making money. Yet this theory had inconsistencies as well. If money was so tight, why didn't the family simply sell some of their valuable assets like cars, boats, or even their other homes or their belongings? With all this turmoil, Sherilyn struggled emotionally and in pain, and she lashed out at Nikki, ultimately cutting off their friendship. Sherilyn also demanded that Bobby stop communicating with Nikki altogether, and as a result, the last time Nikki spoke to Bobby was in April of 2009, when she actually urged him to consider taking Madison and moving back to Oklahoma City, because Nikki believed that some physical distance might protect him and Madison from Sherilyn. And it was because of her worsening mental health. But Bobby refused. He chose to stay, explaining that despite all the challenges, he loved Sherilyn too deeply to ever leave her behind. It sounds like Nikki was trying to protect Sherilyn, but knew that deep down things were pretty bad. I'm sure she didn't want to seem like she was betraying her friend, but she was hoping that she would change. Like if her husband and her daughter were gone, she could say, Sherilyn, you have to change. Something like that.
Things just kept unraveling. Sherilyn's mental health took a serious turn for the worse in early September, right around Colton's 16th birthday. It got so bad that she ended up being hospitalized at St. Anthony's in Oklahoma City after intentionally injuring both of her forearms. That was just a month before the family vanished.
Exactly. And while it's true that certain mental illnesses can increase the likelihood of violent behavior, having a mental health issue alone does not mean that someone's going to become violent. Sherilyn's struggles, though significant, did not automatically suggest that she would harm her family, even if she went so far as to do it to herself.
Following her hospital stay, Sherilyn resumed her medication. Colton recalled meeting with her a few weeks before the family disappeared, noting that she seemed to be doing better and genuinely wanted to improve her life. During their conversation, Sherilyn made no mention of relocating to Panola Mountain or removing Madison from school. It's possible that those decisions were made afterward, perhaps influenced by conversations she had with Bobby after seeing Colton. But still, as the search dragged on with zero sign of the Jamisons, authorities really started leaning toward foul play. They thought that the family might have been murdered, or at the very least that someone else had to be involved, because they had searched everywhere and found absolutely nothing. But then, another lead popped up.
A significant lead. It came in on November 1st. Things were still being uncovered. Questions were being asked, and Nikki remembered something. Actually, someone that she thought might be important to mention. Back in July of 2009, so only a few months before all of this, a man named Kenneth Bellows from Wilburton, Oklahoma, had briefly lived at the Jamison home, helping out with the property, and he described himself as a handyman and supposedly a family friend. This information lined up with a clue that police already uncovered, that prescription bottle they found in the abandoned truck. It had been labeled with the initials KB. And according to both Nikki and Colton, Kenneth often made Sherilyn and Madison very uncomfortable, especially when Bobby wasn't around. Sherilyn frequently openly talked about her Native American Cherokee heritage, describing how it shaped her spiritual beliefs. And during one of these conversations, Kenneth apparently became confrontational. Sherilyn recounted an incident to Nikki later and explained how Kenneth suddenly moved really close to her, putting his face inches from hers, and declared himself a white supremacist. He stated that anyone who was not pure white deserved to die. His words.
Sherilyn saw this as a direct threat, not just to her, but especially to Madison. She rushed Madison into another room and then took Kenneth outside. Once they were out there, she grabbed her gun from the car, aimed it straight at him, and told him to get lost and never come back. And just to really drive the point home, she said she even fired a few shots at the ground near his feet to scare him off.
Yikes. So to me, this was like, okay, wait, she's capable or like not afraid to shoot her gun.
Yeah. People who knew Sherilyn knew she wasn't someone you could mess with. And considering how creepy and intense Kenneth's views were, a lot of folks felt like her reaction made total sense.
But not if she had hit him. Because words alone don't add to a, real threat, like a credible threat against yourself, unless she truly thought that she was in danger. And maybe she did. I mean, he got in her face and basically told her she should die.
Right.
But it's not like he was coming at her with a weapon. She was making him leave, which she has the right to do because he was on her property. But all it did was just create this picture of her that she would like erratically go off and shoot someone.
And to add to that point, Nikki recalled Sherilyn breaking down in tears afterwards, saying she truly never wanted to point the gun at Kenneth. Sherilyn described herself as a gentle person who had no desire to actually hurt anyone. She only used the gun because she felt genuinely threatened and needed to protect herself and her family.
However, Sherilyn later confided in Colton about what happened, and she told him that she'd experienced a sudden intense mood swing, causing her to chase after Kenneth with the pistol, even firing it. She expressed regret deeply about this entire incident. She was actually scared by her own impulsive reaction. She couldn't believe she reacted that way. It frightened her. So she could not control herself when she went into these episodes because that's what I was getting from it. It just appeared that way to detectives. And as they gathered all of this new information, they did do their due diligence and they looked into Kenneth. And they quickly uncovered a lengthy criminal record, primarily involving substances and offenses of that nature. And given Sherilyn's story about Kenneth's disturbing statements on white supremacy, investigators believed they might finally have a clear motive. However, at first, they couldn't even locate Kenneth, and they had to ask the U.S. Marshal for help in tracking him down. But it didn't take long for them to find him. Kenneth was already sitting in jail.
The FBI jumped on it and interviewed Kenneth right away, but he flat out denied having any connection to white supremacy groups. And just like that, investigators hit another dead end. He gave them an alibi for October 8th, the day the Jamesons vanished. He said that he was with his sister Kelly the whole day and night, helping out at a Bible school. And yeah, several people backed up this story.
It's really interesting to me that he's got this like criminal history. He's working at a Bible school, but I mean, that's beside the fact.
What's wild is that Kenneth and Kelly actually expected the cops to reach out once they heard the Jamesons were missing.
It's like people telling on themselves, they're like self-snitch, oh, I'm in trouble.
But Kelly gave a whole different version of events. She said that Kenneth wasn't doing just handyman work, he was actually helping take care of Madison, like getting her ready for school and even taking her there, especially when Bobby and Sherilyn would go off to their timeshare in Cancun for days or weeks at a time.
That's weird.
Kelly was honestly shocked they trusted him with that, especially since he had a felony drug record. Definitely not the kind of background you'd expect for someone to watch a kid.
No, that's really questionable, leaving your child behind with someone that has a record. I mean, this is not a good idea. So maybe that's why they took her out of school. And Kelly also told the investigators that initially she thought Bobby and Sherilyn were nice people, but then over time, they started behaving really oddly, making her feel uneasy. When asked about Kenneth's apparent problems with people who are not white, Kelly strongly denied that. She said, no, he previously married a woman of Native American ancestry. So this was just to back up the he wasn't having a motive to kill anyone. And according to Kelly, the true story was entirely different from what Sherilyn had described. What really happened, according to her, was that Kenneth had called Sherilyn crazy and even labeled her as an antichrist, mostly due to her unusual behavior and her deep beliefs regarding those spirits in her house. Sherilyn, according to accounts, became furious at his remarks and quickly escalated the confrontation by accusing him of harming Madison and bringing up his criminal past. So that is a very different series of events.
However, investigators were cautious about fully accepting Kelly's side of the story. Although Kelly appeared credible, she was Kenneth's sister and naturally inclined to defend him. And realistically, no one being interviewed by the FBI would openly admit involvement with a hate group. A few detainees from around Panola Mountain started bringing up the Jameson case to law enforcement, saying that the family had been murdered by white supremacists who dumped their bodies in a nearby pond. At first, the cops were pretty skeptical. It sounded pretty out there, but with all the stuff that had come about Kenneth, detectives figured it was worth going back for surveillance.
When Sheriff Beaucamp carefully reviewed the footage again, he spotted something new and troubling. Sherilyn could be seen loading a brown briefcase into the back of their truck. Yet this brown briefcase had never been found. Investigators now realized another item was missing, not just Sherilyn's gun. And what was inside that briefcase? Was it more money? And that's what Beaucamp thought. Whoever had been involved in this family's disappearance had likely stolen this briefcase,
completely unaware that the $32,000 was hidden under the seat.
Exactly. After speaking with Colton, Beaucamp realized exactly what had happened. The brown briefcase had contained Sherilyn's half of the $64,000 settlement from Bobby's car accident. So this raised another alarming possibility. Maybe someone had stolen Sherilyn's briefcase full of cash and then harmed the family to cover their tracks. Well, that's a better theory than some of the other ones. Most people know that not much can fit inside of a briefcase. So if anyone does see one, maybe they would be wondering what was inside. So they held them at gunpoint, made them open it, and then harmed them.
Connie suspected her daughter Sherilyn might have gotten involved with a religious cult. She felt certain that someone must have harmed the family, explaining that Bobby and Sherilyn would have never willingly allowed anything bad to happen to their daughter, or their dog Maisie. Even if they were completely sober, Connie pointed out that there were many strange religious cults active in Oklahoma at that time. In fact, Connie revealed that shortly before Sherilyn's disappearance, Sherilyn told her that she believed that she was on a hit list for a cult. Sherilyn had seemed genuinely frightened, but she refused to specify which group was involved.
Right. And this was going to the fact that they brought that money up there in the briefcase. They were thinking that maybe it was like ransom or she was paying them off so that they wouldn't harm her. And adding to these suspicions, Nikki received a very disturbing anonymous phone call. A woman reached out asking if Nikki was the one searching for the Jameson family. The woman claimed that she had been in a group called the United White Knights. You can figure out what this group was. We said it many times already. And described seeing a book containing a list of names, people the group considered problems. They were white people. They thought these other people were problems, and they wanted them eliminated. After rallies, she would memorize the names and later look them up online, often describing that some of these individuals had gone missing, and she believed the Jameson family might have been targeted the same way. The anonymous caller knew specific private details about Bobby, including the unique insignia on his wedding ring, something very few people were aware of. But according to this caller, Kenneth, the same man who had previously stayed with the Jamesons and looked after Madison, had allegedly put Sherilyn on this hit list. And one of Kenneth's associates had carried out the attack.
Initially, Nikki found the details convincing and credible. However, the caller then claimed that Madison was still alive, kidnapped by a man in Texas named Charles, allegedly connected to the same hate group. When Nikki investigated this claim, she quickly discovered that Charles had been incarcerated at the exact time of the Jamesons' disappearance, making the scenario impossible.
But can you imagine all of this? Just like, this is what people don't see behind the scenes on all of these crimes. Like whenever somebody goes missing and whenever something happens, these families, this is what they're dealing with. This is why they're so grief-stricken. It's like they're dealing with not only their family member being gone, but then all of these I'm just going to call them weirdos, but just like people calling in and claiming they know what happened. And then your heart sinks and you're like, oh my God, my family, was targeted.
Because you want to hope that every question has an answer.
Right. And you're hoping that you're going to get closer to what happened.
The woman further claimed that she'd overheard conversations within the group clearly referencing Sherilyn, Bobby, and Madison, suggesting that they had to be taken care of. Even more disturbingly, the caller mentioned hearing one man from the group describe placing Madison on his lap and how much he enjoyed it.
Ew, that's just horrific. Like, even if, especially if she made that up and it's not true.
Yeah.
It's like your mind is going to a really gross place. And despite the initial compelling details, this final allegation was just so far-fetched, leading Nikki to just dismiss the entire story as being not credible at all. But still, Nikki hadn't completely dismissed the possibility that other groups or cults, especially those known to take advantage of remote, isolated places like Panola Mountain, could be involved. The area made her really uneasy, and while conducting her own investigations there, she encountered groups of people, unfamiliar cars with Texas license plates, and even heard gunshots, which she took as warnings to stay away.
But then something shocking happened on December 9th, 2009. Bobby's dad, Bob Sr., died, reportedly from natural causes. He left nothing to Bobby or Starlet, instead leaving his entire estate to his granddaughter Madison. However, the will specified that if Madison also passed away or could not inherit the estate, everything would then go to Bob's brother, Jack Jameson.
And almost immediately, rumors circulated that Bob Sr. hadn't actually died naturally, but instead from a sinister deed, somebody giving him a little too much of his medications. These suspicions complicated matters even further. On December 16th, Starlet attempted to file a claim for Bob's estate, but her efforts failed because Bob had recently updated his will. Just 2 days later, Jack challenged Starlet's claim, asserting his rights as executor of the will and making it clear he knew about the changes that Bob had made. Private investigator Heather Holland traveled from Michigan after Madison's 7th birthday to help with the investigation. And Heather believes strongly in the approach of following the money to uncover the truth. And after learning about this complicated legal history between Bobby, his father, and all the rumors to organize crime in Mexico and all the other things that we've already told you, she became convinced these financial issues might hold critical answers to the family's disappearance.
Heather went over everything closely, including that unsettling photo of Madison, and even brought in search dogs to check the area. She wasn't buying that Sherilyn killed Bobby and then herself and Madison. Her main point was that if that actually had happened, their bodies would have been found much closer to the road.
Well, not if she went to another place to do it after that happened.
Of course. Plus, it doesn't add up that they'd leave their dog, Maisie, locked in the trunk. And I would argue that it does. Why not?
Right. If you're going to get away and make it look like somebody else kidnapped you, that's what I said too. I was like, maybe they would.
Heather didn't buy the idea that the Jamesons just got lost either, especially since Bobby knew the outdoors really well, but at the same time, she couldn't find anything to back up the hope that they were still alive out there somewhere. Heather also ruled Dylan out as a suspect. She said he genuinely seemed like a nice guy. She even mentioned that Sheriff Beaucamp had bought bath products from Dylan's little business.
But they were all thinking that there was something weird going on with that as well.
Right.
In his bath product business. We're going to get to that. But diving deeper into the family's financial and divorce records, Heather discovered that Bob Sr. had significant assets. She shared these findings with the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. The timeline she uncovered was alarming. Bob Sr. filed for divorce, and then he rewrote his will on October 27th of 2008. The divorce was finalized in August of 2009, and Bob entered hospice care the following month. Just 1 month later, in October, the Jameson family vanished. Shortly afterward, in December, Bob Sr. himself passes away. So that is a very suspicious timeline.
Right, and to Heather, the timing of everything just felt way too connected to be a coincidence. What really stood out was the simultaneous death clause, which is normally something a couple might file in case they both die in, like, a car crash. But Heather thought it was super strange that someone would link Bob's death to Madison's, especially since she was just a kid.
Right. This is like if you and I, something was happening and we both died, it would go to this person or like our daughter. So it's weird to say that about a baby. Like, I mean, she's not a baby. She's 7 at this point. They hadn't been found, but she was 6 when all this was happening. So why would she die?
Right.
Strange.
If something happened to her, she'd be worth a lot of money. And that part seriously raised some red flags. Almost $1 million worth of red flags.
$800,000. So at this point, Starlet and Jack soon begin to fight over Bob's estate, despite the fact that Madison was still officially missing. And this struck many people as suspicious, since with Madison's disappearance, the simultaneous death clause could potentially apply, and it would be impossible to know who passed away first, Bob or Madison. So this entire situation raised serious concerns that something shady was going on behind the scenes. Heather Holland strongly suspected family involvement. She found Starlet's attitude towards her missing son and granddaughter strangely detached, describing her as very cold when discussing Bobby and his family. Heather shared her own theory, explaining, "We know the Jamisons met someone up on that mountain because of the way the truck was parked. It looked like they had been blocked in. I believe someone forced them out at gunpoint. Someone must have known they'd be there. And considering the bad blood between Jack and Bobby, I think Jack Jamison could be involved. He had the means, motive, and opportunity, but he probably hired someone else to do it," she said.
By 2010, Investigation Discovery did a documentary on the Jamison case, and it finally got a lot more attention. Up until then, investigators had been hitting dead ends. Everyone they looked into had a solid alibi, but at the same time, they couldn't totally rule out anyone either. They were desperate for new leads, but the people living around the Red Oak were super private and they didn't want to talk, which made things a lot harder. The local realtor, Peggy Cook, who had been helping the Jamisons before they disappeared, kept checking in with the investigators. She really seemed worried about Madison, and her concern felt genuine.
But it also could look weird.
Right.
Like you're checking in for a year now, or however long it's been. Now it's 2010. So she's like, "So any updates on the case?" So it could go both ways.
Sure, but investigators were convinced that Peggy wasn't involved. The case just went cold. A year passed, and then another, and eventually Sheriff Beaucamp stepped down. The whole thing weighed on him. He felt guilty and unsettled by the fact that it was still unsolved. When he left the office, he said the biggest clues were the missing briefcase and the gun. If those ever turned up, I'm sure the truth would finally come out.
The next sheriff who stepped in held a different opinion. He questioned whether the Jamisons had truly been forced out of their vehicle at all, believing instead that they might have left voluntarily. However, his successor disagreed, making it clear he intended to give the Jamison case a renewed attention. And clearly, turnover among law enforcement in this part of Oklahoma was frequent, each official bringing different perspectives to this investigation because they were having like 3 different ones at this point. Many deputies felt strongly that the Jamisons' disappearance was premeditated. They suspected someone in town had known that Sherilyn and Bobby were headed out to the mountains with a substantial amount of money, and they intentionally targeted them. The Investigation Discovery documentary echoed that suspicion, suggesting the family's vehicle was deliberately blocked on that narrow mountain road, forcing them to stop. It implied someone else had likely approached from behind, trapping them on the mountain. And this broadcast was the first major media coverage of the case, and it garnered a lot of new tips.
Hundreds of viewers across the country reported sightings of the Jamisons after that episode aired. Most callers sincerely believed they'd seen the family. However, none of these leads turned out to be credible. By this point, the search on Panola Mountain had long been suspended. Authorities began to wonder if it was possible that the family had staged their disappearance. Over the years, investigators chased lead after lead, but every single one ended in frustration. With a case this big, it naturally drew in a mix of people. Some who genuinely wanted to help, and others who just wanted to stir things up and fed investigators false info. That's so messed up that people do that.
And they do. And they try to like insert themselves into the investigation, but they're not involved in any way.
For family members like Starlet, not knowing was the worst part. She really struggled with the uncertainty, just trying to live with the fact that her only son and granddaughter were gone without a trace.
4 years went by without answers. In October of 2010, Nikki organized a candlelight vigil at Posey Park and a balloon release at the Jamison family home, hoping to keep the case alive in people's minds. Latimer County is a very small community, and although not everyone had liked Sherilyn and Bobby, many locals still deeply cared about finding out what happened to them, especially little Madison. Then on July 28th of 2012, Nikki posted an important update to her Jamison Warriors group on Facebook. She explained that she had been carefully reviewing the security footage taken the day the family vanished. Initially, she thought Bobby had simply changed shirts during that video. But then, after close inspection, freezing every frame, and carefully analyzing the details, she was back thinking and became convinced that it actually showed two different men. Bobby wearing the white shirt and an unknown person wearing the brown or gray shirt.
Nikki explained her theory in detail, believing the family's strange behavior in the footage meant that they were being watched or forced by someone else. She writes, "If you closely watch the last minute Bobby appears in his white t-shirt going toward the truck, you'll notice the driver's side window briefly illuminate, as if he got inside. Later, when the man in the brown shirt approaches, the driver's side window remains illuminated, suggesting Bobby was already in the truck."
Yeah, so, she's going back to that theory that there was another man there. And even after several years, Nikki was still deeply committed to finding answers. Her dedication made it clear how much she cared, but it was also heartbreaking. So much time had passed, and she was still desperately searching for the truth. And in January 2013, two adult bodies were discovered in Lake Eufaula, very close to where the Jamison home was located. When Nikki heard the news, she was anxiously waiting for the results, hoping that it might bring some answers. However, the testing revealed the remains were actually prehistoric. They were completely unrelated to the Jamison family. It was just another dead end. And even though it's sad to think that, the Jamisons could be dead, at least they would be found. But finally, and I mean finally this time, something big happened.
On November 16th, 2013, around 2 p.m., Tim and Sherilyn Graham,
A different Sherilyn,
were out with their kids, scouting for deer hunting spots near an outpost at Smokestack Hollow, just south of Quinta and north of the Sandboys Mountains. It's a pretty remote area, mostly just hunters and campers who go out there. While they were exploring, they suddenly came across human remains. They immediately contacted police, and although authorities had previously conducted grid searches in the area, these remains hadn't been discovered until now.
the skeletal remains were found approximately 2.7 miles northwest from the location where the Jamisons' white GMC pickup truck had been found abandoned. Though due to the rugged terrain, traveling this distance on foot would have required roughly a 7-mile hike. The spot where the remains were found was somewhat secluded, though not completely isolated, about 150 yards from the road connecting nearby mountain properties to a well pad. When police arrived, they discovered 3 skulls lying face down, arranged very oddly in what appeared to be a triangular pattern. The bones were clearly quite old and showed significant damage from animal activity.
Tim Graham recalled noticing what he believed was a bullet hole in one of the skulls. He said it had the frayed, jagged edges typical of an exit wound. He also emphasized that while animals could have moved the bones, he found it highly unlikely they would have arranged the skulls so precisely, about 15 yards apart in a clear triangular shape. He said, animals might have dragged something, but there's no way in hell animals would have dragged them into a perfect triangle. What Tim found especially strange was that he and his family had been visiting this exact location regularly for over a decade and had never seen these remains before.
Soon afterward, the FBI contacted Jack Jamison to inform him that they had found remains belonging to 3 individuals, though at this point, they hadn't confirmed if they were the Jamison family. The chief medical examiner confirmed that the remains belonged to 2 adults and 1 child, and planned a thorough forensic examination. They did warn that this process could take anywhere from a few days to several years, and that's because the condition, where they were found. But despite this uncertainty, Jack, Nikki, Starlet, and Connie were already convinced that these were their missing loved ones. Jack expressed his sadness, but also relief, saying, quote, "It brings closure. That's about all I can say. It's sad. but it's what we expected, end quote. Like many others, he remains certain that foul play or murder had occurred.
On July 3rd of 2014, the remains found at Smokestack Hollow were officially identified as belonging to the Jamison family. Autopsies were performed on all 3 sets of remains, but unfortunately, investigators couldn't determine an exact cause or manner of death due to the advanced decomposition and incompleteness of skeletons. Authorities listed the deaths as occurring under suspicious circumstances, with identities confirmed through DNA analysis and dental comparisons. Bobby's remains were examined on June 12, 2014 at a morgue in Tulsa, Oklahoma by medical examiner Joshua Lanter. His remains were described as incomplete, consisting of primarily the skull, 1 molar, both femurs, and the right upper arm bone. The rest of the skeleton was missing, likely scattered or taken by animals. Near his remains, investigators found pieces of 2 boots, a clothing label, and an unusual piece of flexible material with fabric on one side, possibly part of the missing briefcase, though this was never confirmed. No evidence of trauma at the time of death was found on Bobby's remains. A small hole noticed in his skull was officially attributed to animal activity, and despite thorough searches of the area, no bullet or shell casing was ever recovered.
It's very interesting. I mean, it's true. Like animals could have taken those remains, but then there are theories that dismemberment happened and that wasn't the case. And Sherilyn's remains included her skull with 10 teeth still intact, along with her left upper arm bone, humerus, her left pelvic bone, and her left thigh bone. Alongside her bones, investigators recovered the remains of a bra cup and part of a greenish-brown leather-like boot. Madison's remains included her skull and a white shoe decorated with rhinestones. Near the shoe was a dried flower, appearing to have been deliberately placed there. Despite these detailed examinations, the exact circumstances about how the Jamisons had died were unknown. But the autopsy reports clearly indicated that animal activity had heavily impacted the Jamisons' remains. In his investigative book, journalist Jake Anderson provided a detailed map based on GPS coordinates, pinpointing where each set of remains and belongings were found. This map suggested the family may have been decomposed in different locations before the remains were scattered.
So could animals explain why the bones were missing? It's possible, but the sheer number and types of bones and teeth missing raised doubts. It seemed more likely that the bodies had initially been buried or left exposed elsewhere and then later moved or scattered.
Exactly. At the time the Jamisons vanished, the forest faced a severe problem with feral hogs, and this wasn't just a local issue. Wild pigs had become a major nuisance across Oklahoma, and according to one article from 2009 titled "War Against Wild Hogs Rages On Across Oklahoma," wildlife officials had been fighting an uphill battle against these aggressive invasive pigs for a decade. And due to this, the FBI believed that the small hole in Bobby's skull might have been caused by a wild hog tusk. Plausible. However, Tim Graham, the person who originally discovered the remains, had a different theory. He vividly described to Jake Anderson, the author of that book, quote, "If you place your finger on your nose and move it straight up to the top of your head, then about 2 inches to the right, that's exactly where the hole was. I remember it like it was yesterday. It looked like a perfect gunshot hole, as if someone had placed a gun beneath his chin," end quote. He was referring to Bobby. Tim explained his theory further, saying the other 2 skulls had no visible holes, so my guess is Bobby shot his wife. Then, as their daughter ran away, he shot her, and then, overwhelmed by guilt, he turned the gun on himself. So do you understand that theory? And that's why the bones were in different places?
Sure.
So I hope that's not confusing, but his theory was that that's why the bodies were in different places. And Tim also mentioned he didn't recall seeing any obvious chew marks on the skull, and he acknowledged that memory can sometimes be unreliable, though. So did he really see these things, or is he remembering it differently?
Private investigator Heather Holland believed that the family's remains were not originally located at Smokestack Hollow. She suggested that the bodies might have been placed there after initial searches were concluded, making it unlikely that this area was the original crime scene. Sheriff Beauchamp felt especially puzzled. He was certain that he'd thoroughly searched the Smokestack Hollow area, including the very ditch that the remains were eventually found. Tim Graham expressed frustration and suspicion about the investigation, pointing out that he never received the $1,000 reward offered for discovering the Jameson family's remains. He found this troubling and wondered if the FBI or the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation or someone else was trying to conceal the truth.
After reviewing the autopsy results, the OSBI and the FBI officially closed the Jamison family case. The Latimer County Sheriff's Office, being a smaller agency, had no choice but to accept the decision of the larger investigative agencies. Even though numerous questions and uncertainties still lingered, former Sheriff Beauchamp later returned to the department to get an update after learning the Jamison's bodies had been found, and since the case was considered officially closed, he asked federal agents directly about their cause of death. The agent replied, quote, "All evidence suggests natural causes. It was likely an accident. They probably got lost and died from exposure or hypothermia," end quote.
When Beauchamp questioned the agent about the possibility of a bullet hole in Bobby's skull, the agent explained that the pathologist had concluded the damage was caused by animals, then asked Beauchamp if he suspected a murder self-inflicted death. Beauchamp asked if the gun had ever been found. When the agent confirmed that there was no gun recovered, Beauchamp remained convinced that the family had been murdered.
Right. When it's self-inflicted, the gun can only be right there.
Of course.
So Beauchamp's theory was that Bobby and Sherilyn had likely been shot in the back of the head while Madison had not been shot. She ultimately died from exposure after being left in the wilderness because she was, there with her family and she didn't leave their side, which is just heartbreaking. But let's talk about some alternative theories and also let us know what you think. It's rare that we do a case like this, but that's why we did it. It's heartbreaking and confusing, but what happened? Here are a few theories and we'll just briefly go through it. And then afterwards, we'll tell you our thoughts.
First, there's the Dylan theory. Investigators looked into this guy we've been calling Dylan. His initials are DC. He's lived nearby and talked to the Jamisons shortly before they vanished. Officially, he said he sold bath bombs, but some deputies and even Nikki thought he might have actually been selling bath salts, which were pretty common and shady in that area. People also got suspicious about the fresh concrete foundation that he was pouring, and not gonna lie, some wondered if he was hiding something under it. Later on, Nikki saw a guy also going by DC on an episode of America's Most Wanted. He'd been arrested for murder in California. She was convinced that it was the same guy, but when Sheriff Beauchamp watched the footage, he said he didn't recognize him at all. So the question now is, were there actually two different guys going by DC in the area? Or was someone pretending to be him the whole time? Who knows?
These are not our theories, by the way. These are theories that are like the biggest theories out there. But what he's saying is like they saw this other guy named DC who it's just his initials and they don't show his identity.
Right.
So they're thinking like, oh, two people. But I'm like, DC is common letters of people's names.
Yeah.
And then there's the shared psychosis theory. This is another theory that focuses on Sherilyn and Bobby's mental health. Sherilyn had bipolar and a strong belief in spirits, angels, and demons. Bobby, though not diagnosed, also reported seeing supernatural entities. So experts suggested a condition called shared psychosis. I'm not going to say it in French because there's a French name for it too, but it's when one person's delusions spread to those that are close to them. It's possible Bobby adopted Sherilyn's spiritual fears, while Sherilyn embraced Bobby's desire to live isolated and off-grid, and their intense combined mental states, fueled by maybe substance use, we don't know, but definitely opioid withdrawal because they were taking those meds, or even the church apocalyptic teachings, could have caused them paranoia or distress. And even if it didn't involve any substances, their trauma, chronic pain, mental illnesses could have triggered a tragic outcome. And then there are other popular theories, about 9 of them, and these we're not going to go into. We're just going to tell the overarching theme of them. So one is the murder and then self-inflicted death, Bobby or Sherilyn harming the family, possibly due to mental illness or extreme stress.
Number 2, family conflict. Bob Sr., Jack, or other family members motivated by financial disputes.
3, there's Kenneth and the whole cult group that targets people who are not white or someone connected to Kenneth or any extremist groups.
Number 4, substance-related issues. Victims of substance debts, or informing authorities about illegal substances.
5 local suspects, Dylan, or who we're calling Dylan, but DC, or another unknown mountain man responsible for foul play.
Number 6 is Kevin Sweat, local criminal suspected by some of harming the Jamesons.
Number 7 was religious cult or witchcraft, victims of extremist cults due to their belief systems.
Number 8 is paranormal theories, supernatural explanations involving ghosts or even Bigfoot.
That was actually a theory online.
Yeah.
I mean, I know we're going to laugh, but that was a big theory. Or number 9, accidental death, that they simply got lost in the wilderness and succumbed to exposure. Ultimately, each theory has flaws or unanswered questions. Investigators, family, and community members continue to debate what truly happened to the Jamison family. And while researching the story, I came across a pretty scary local statement from someone. It was, quote, "The people up there know what's up, but you keep your mouth shut or they'll come after you," end quote. Others describe the situation as a known secret, suggesting that many locals believe they know who's responsible, but they're afraid to say it. While there are so many theories out there, I personally struggle with any that blame the victims. Considering all of the evidence, it seems likely that the family was intentionally targeted, possibly because of their unique beliefs or lifestyles. And I think that the 2 main ones are kind of on the top of my list. The top one is that they did get lost, that they were like dehydrated and confused, didn't know what they were, where they were. And because they're already suffering from a lot of other things, I think that alone could have made them like hesitate where to go. And they just ended up being in the elements like that. What about you?
My theory is, look, this place has been said to be sort of impoverished, right? People are struggling with substance abuse. And when someone goes around saying, hey, we got a bunch of money from a settlement, we're going to go buy some property somewhere, somebody catches wind like, oh, this can fund my next stint, for lack of a better word. So they were forced at gunpoint. And look, the bodies were later found years later in a cleared, previously searched area.
Yeah. Also a good point is that when you're saying that, my brain went to, they found like a handle of the briefcase. They found a part of the briefcase. And I was thinking like one of them was holding it. And then, it was probably the dad, let's just say.
Look, and with their, mental health issues, let's just say they were paranoid. I would strongly believe that they wouldn't keep any money in a bank, because why would you trust a bank if you're thinking that way?
Well, we know they didn't. They kept it under the seat and they kept it in a briefcase.
So they would always keep their money with them with a gun. Right. So let's just say that person was, stalking them, and then they found out that, oh, there's a gun, I'm going to use that, and didn't realize that there's a manila envelope under the seat. They only saw the briefcase.
Right. Yeah. All of these things could, be, and they're all theories, right? We don't know what happened, but I do think positioning of the bodies, I don't think they were killed there. I mean, like now that I'm thinking that, I'm changing my thoughts as we're speaking. I'm thinking they were not killed there because there were probably more teeth, more things, but when they were moved, those things dislodged, they came apart, they were missing because of the fact that they were moved to a different location.
Right. Someone waited for the heat to die down and then moved the bodies.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we will never know. And without direct evidence, this case may remain unsolved forever. The mountain, this entire case, it's a place where secrets run deep and the truth remains buried beneath layers of personal demons and hidden histories. Connie strongly believes that Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison encountered something dangerous, something they weren't meant to see, leading someone to target them deliberately. She and Colton both remain convinced the family was murdered. They emphasize that the Jamisons would never willingly leave behind their GPS, their cell phones, their coats, and especially their dog.
So where does this leave us? In 2017, the courts determined that Madison's half-brother Colton would inherit a portion of the estate. That following year, in 2018, Starlet requested access to all official documents from the medical examiner, including photographs, tissue samples, and blood samples, in order to finalize some outstanding legal matters related to the family.
Today, the Jamison family disappearance remains unsolved. Investigators continue to encourage anyone with information or potential leads to reach out to Latimer Police Department at 918-465-2161. We're going to leave that number below.
Colton has moved forward with his life, and he now operates specialized logging equipment at Drill Right Technology and has experience in landscaping and theology. Reflecting on his journey, Colton shared, "Honestly, I'm probably doing better now than I ever have. I'm on the up and up. You can't sit back and dwell. I've got 2 kids of my own now. I'm married, and I gotta build stuff up for them, you know?"
And Nikki eventually had to step back from the case because it had gotten to an obsessive level. And when she reflected on her own experience, she said, "One thing I learned from this case is that if you're not perfect, and if you struggle with mental illness, or if you handle your problems in ways that society finds unconventional, you won't receive the same kindness and compassion as others, even when you desperately need it." And that's sad. Sherilyn genuinely wanted to heal, but circumstances and obstacles continually prevented her from receiving the proper help she needed. And tragically, it appears that she and her family may have fell victim to someone who took advantage of their vulnerabilities. But above all, please listen and analyze the story with empathy and compassion, because no matter the circumstances, the loss of the Jamison family was an immense tragedy. It was deeply felt by Nikki, Colton, and countless others who loved Bobby, Sherilyn, and especially little Madison. And always be respectful in the comments. It's okay to theorize. We want your thoughts, but you never know who's reading the comments. This family could be reading the comments, people connected to this case. So just keep that in mind.
Thank you so much for taking the time and listening to this story.
We will see you in our very next video. Bye.